I am 74 years old, and the house knows it before anyone else does. The floorboards keep my secrets, the kettle learns my rhythms, the porch light blinks awake a few minutes before sunset, because I set the timer that way years ago, when my wife was still alive, and we thought small comforts could be engineered once and enjoyed forever. Which is how you think when you believe time is your partner and not your constant auditor. My name is George Henley. I taught American literature to ninth graders in Provo for the better part of 4 decades. And if you ask me what I miss most, it would not be the chalk or the tidy rows, or the way Halloween carved the attention out of the room. It would be the moment after the bell when a boy or girl would hesitate at the door and turn back with a question that was really a confession about a father who drank, or a mother who slept too long, or a fear that Macbeth was contagious. And I would say something mild and honest, and stay late to find the page that had once comforted me. It has been 6 years since my wife, Ruth, faltered in the kitchen and left me with the simmering stew. And if grief has a noise, it is the click of a stove turned off when there is no one to taste what you saved. I have kept my life plain, because I do not trust ornament any more. I wake early even when the night has been choppy. I brew coffee that is always a little too strong, because I forget to level the scoop. I sit at the small table we never replaced after the girls grew up, and I watch the light stain the back fence, and then climb it. And I tell myself, I will walk before the heat comes, which I sometimes do and sometimes do not. My friends have thinned to a manageable number, which is the polite way to say cancer and distance accomplished what disagreements could not. I see a couple from church who remember me as Brother Henley, and who still press hymn books into their chests as if they might leap away. And I play one night a week at a men's cribbage circle where the jokes are older than the cards. And on Sundays I sit at the far left of the third pew so I can watch the door and not be surprised by an usher's urgency. If you ask what keeps me wanting a longer morning, the answer is my daughter's children. The 2 I am allowed to call by their names, even when I am alone, because names are a form of prayer said without offending anyone. Sam is 10 and thinks in diagrams. Lucy is 8 and keeps small rocks in her pockets, so she will remember the places that gave them, and when they visit, which used to be every other weekend, and since the divorce has dwindled to, when it's convenient, the house looks a decade younger, as if laughter makes paint glossy. I show them how to scramble eggs without browning them. I let them use the heavy flashlight to explore the crawl space, because a supervised fear is the bargain that teaches bravery. And we read in the living room with our feet on the ottoman Ruth chose, which dips in the middle exactly where her calves taught it to. Their mother, my daughter Allison, arrives with reminders on her phone and an irritation that is almost a perfume. She is 39 and sharp in both senses. The kind of woman who knows the rules at school better than the principal and can argue the cost of a furnace filter into a moral referendum. And I love her very much, which sounds simple, until you try it through years that include her teenage contempt and my old man caution and the distance that opens when you do not have the courage to say, I am afraid you are choosing a life that will hurt you. Her ex-husband, Nate, is a span of quiet in a loud world. He once helped me install a new garbage disposal, and I thought we might turn that small mercy into a friendship. But marriages end the way a movie credit scrolls past the audience you thought you belonged to, and you do not go into the lobby to beg for a sequel. There are days when I believe I am managing the indignities with a kind of grace. I go to the hardware store and the clerk calls me sir rather than buddy, which is a generous promotion. I change the batteries in the smoke detectors. I sit on the back steps with a paperback and let the afternoon happen to me without forcing a meaning out of it. And I think of my mother, who saved buttons in a jar, because one day you'll be grateful for not throwing away what isn't broken. and how that became a sermon I gave my students when they wanted to abandon a book by page 50. And then there are days when the silence in the house feels as if it has grown limbs and is learning to move furniture around at night. I wake, and the chair is tilted, the rug is slightly off. The framed family photo is turned inward as if ashamed. And I tell myself this is only the mind rehearsing for an ending it still refuses to accept. I talk to Ruth when I fold laundry because I was clumsy at it when we were young, and she would take the shirt from my hands and perform a small miracle. And I tell her about the neighbor's dog that refuses to bark at me because we have reached an understanding, and about the cashier who slipped me a coupon without making me perform gratitude, and about the way Lucy's face changed when she understood that commas could keep a sentence from running out of breath. Sorrow does not ruin the whole day. It only stains the corners. And if you keep your eyes on the middle, you can forget that your life is fraying. I keep a record of the practical things because it gives the impression of control. In a notebook by the phone, where the long curly cord once tied itself into knots that Ruth pretended were decorations, I write the dates of oil changes and the names of the people who came to the door with clipboards, and I tape receipts for the roof repair I finally surrendered to. And I make lists that include almonds and light bulbs and call Allison about Saturday, which I underline twice and then hesitate over, because conversations with my daughter have become negotiations about time and weather and who owes whom an apology for a comment that sounded harsher than it meant. She lives 20 minutes away, yet the distance is measured in suspicion. She calls me Dad, but the word hangs in the air like an object we both used to use for something else. When I see her car in my driveway, I feel a child's hope that I am about to be chosen for a team. And then she comes in with a folded schedule and a sigh and says, "We're tight this month, so we might need you on Thursdays." As if I am a utility she rents. I suppose I accept the role, because it keeps me near the children, and because the humility, unpleasant as it is, feels like an act of penance for all the clumsy sentences I delivered when she was young, the lectures I hid in patience, the way I insisted on curfews and homework and a church dress with sleeves on the Sunday she wanted to be seen. In the evenings, I go through boxes that I should have thinned long ago. I find the program from Allison's high school play, where she had 2 lines and the smile of a person who believes the future will hand her a microphone. I find the letter I wrote to Ruth from a teacher conference in Denver, where the hotel sheets were too crisp to sleep in, and I listed the names of students who made me glad my life was not wasted. And I find an old recorder, a little black thing with a red button, that I used when the district made us prove we were not inventing conversations with parents. I had almost forgotten it, though I suppose I never throw away any instrument that once allowed me to be competent. Technology has outrun me with a cheerful cruelty. The phone updates itself and removes features I liked, as if it is cleaning my house without my permission. But I have learned enough to save voicemail and to check the calendar my daughter shares with me in bursts of generosity. When the house is dark, I sit in the den with the recorder in my hand, like a relic, and I imagine the sound of Ruth's steps, the tinny laugh of a child version of my daughter asking for water at bedtime, the soft clatter of dishes that told me I could linger in my book for 10 more minutes. It is not a haunting so much as a rehearsal for a kindness that refuses to expire. If I am honest about my health, which I try to be because my students once taught me that truth is not the same as self-pity, I would admit that I move more slowly than I pretend, that I read the menu longer than I need to because choosing is an admission that appetite has limits, that I sleep like a guard and wake like a penitent. The doctor tells me my numbers are fine and that I should walk more, and I promise him I will. And then I drive to the grocery store because discipline is easier when someone is watching. I have not lost my mind. I misplace it sometimes in the pantry or on the porch, But it returns like a friendly dog who refuses to learn resentment. And I hold on to that because I know what it looks like when memory starts to fray. I watched Ruth's aunt forget her address and then her husband's face, and I stood in a nursing home hallway while a television shouted sports to no one. And I told myself that love must be a muscle, because the only way to keep it from atrophying is to use it even when it hurts. I keep thinking there must be a way to make peace with Allison that does not involve apologies neither of us can believe. Perhaps reconciliation is a series of small, unadvertised tasks, like bringing over soup when the children have the flu, like fixing the latch on her backyard gate without billing her for the hour of my mood, like letting a remark about the way I fold towels slide past without catching it and turning it into proof. I imagine a conversation where she says, "Dad, I need you," without the edge that turns need into accusation. And I answer, "I'm here," without the lecturing policies that built my identity when I was paid to enforce them. When I am brave, I dial her number and let it ring twice, and then hang up, so the call does not look like a plea. I tell myself I am practicing reaching out. When I am less brave, I bake a loaf of banana bread and eat half of it warm, and wonder who taught us to believe that family is a right that can never be revoked, when in truth it is a permission you renew or forget to. The truth is that a life can feel sturdy until someone closes a door without a reason that satisfies your private court. Then the whole structure creaks, and you discover how much weight you asked one hinge to bear. I do not say this to dramatize the ordinary, only to explain why a simple text from Allison, "Need to talk tomorrow," can turn my evening into a tribunal with no defendant present. I spent years counseling adolescents not to catastrophize, and now I walk the kitchen muttering my own admonitions and making tea I do not drink. If I could confess to Ruth one thing, it would be that I am still learning how to be a father when the audience has grown up and left, and come back demanding a different performance. If I could confess to Allison one thing, it would be that under all my rules was a fear that the world would not be kind to her. And under all her rules is a fear that I will not be kind to her either. So here I am, a man with a tidy lawn and a stack of library books and a pair of grandchildren who draw me superheroes with my ears too big, living a life that would look peaceful if you drove by slowly. I am not unhappy so much as watchful, which can feel like the same thing if you are alone for long enough. I want more time not to change the past, but to make a better use of my politeness. I want one day where Allison sits at my table with the children and asks for the honey, and I pass it without giving her a map of how we might proceed. And we proceed anyway. Until then, I keep the porch light on a little longer than necessary, because schedules do not understand longing, and I water the geraniums Ruth chose because they forgive neglect and flare back if you give them any chance at all. And I wait for footsteps on the path. And if they do not come, I tell myself tomorrow is a word that still fits in my mouth. It was a Tuesday morning in early September when the first crack opened, quiet and domestic, the kind of morning that should have passed without consequence. The air was sharp with the smell of wet lawns, and the neighborhood was already moving in the rhythm of school buses and garage doors. I was at the kitchen sink rinsing my mug, watching the sunlight fold itself into the chrome faucet, when the phone began to ring with a persistence that felt rehearsed. I let it go twice, assuming it was another survey, and then, out of habit more than curiosity, I answered. The voice on the other end was polite but official, too neutral to belong to anyone who wanted something kind from me. "Mr. Henley, this is Officer Beale from the county precinct. We'd like to ask you to come down to the station for a short conversation." There was nothing dramatic in his tone, and yet I felt my breath thicken in my throat. I asked what it was about, and he said, "It's regarding a family matter." We'd rather not discuss it over the phone. A family matter. That phrase, so harmless in itself, carried a chill that seemed to seep directly into my spine. I remember sitting down at the table, the same one Ruth had chosen 40 years ago because she liked the color of the grain, and feeling as though the air in the room had changed density. I was 74 years old, a man whose biggest recent transgression had been forgetting to return a library book, and yet the officer's tone had placed me squarely in the category of people who must explain themselves. I called Allison immediately, half expecting her to answer with irritation, half hoping she would laugh it off and tell me it was some bureaucratic mix-up about taxes or property. She didn't answer. I left a message, tried again, and when the line went straight to voicemail, I told myself she was probably at work. But something inside me had already shifted. The steadiness I had built through routine, coffee, newspaper, the hum of the refrigerator, had been replaced by a trembling alertness, the body's primitive response to danger it cannot yet name. At the precinct, the world changed registers. Everything smelled of disinfectant and paper. I was led into a small office with a single window covered by blinds that never opened all the way. The officer was courteous, even gentle, but his eyes held the kind of caution people use around something fragile that might explode. He said there had been a statement made by a member of my family that an investigation was being opened, and that for now I wasn't under arrest, but it was best I didn't contact anyone directly involved. He spoke in a careful monotone, as if reciting from a manual designed to prevent empathy. I asked who had made the statement, but he wouldn't answer. When he slid a paper across the desk with my name on it, my hands refused to move. I could read only fragments: allegations, pending review, custody hearing. My mind tried to construct meaning and kept collapsing under its own disbelief. I walked home as if carrying something invisible and heavy. Every familiar landmark looked slightly false, as though the world had been repainted overnight in cheaper colors. I stood on the porch for a long time, unable to turn the key. Inside, the house greeted me with the quiet it always offered. But now the quiet felt accusatory, as if every wall had been told a story about me that I couldn't contradict. I poured a glass of water, spilled half of it, sat down, stood up again, and finally called Nate, my former son-in-law, hoping for some thread of sanity. He answered, surprised, his voice hesitant. When I said I'd just come from the station, there was a pause so long I thought the call had dropped. "George," he said finally, "I think you should talk to a lawyer." His tone had the brittle courtesy of a man walking backward from a fire. By evening, word had spread faster than reason. The neighbors who once waved from their driveways now pretended to be absorbed in their lawns. At church, my pastor left a voicemail expressing concern and suggesting I refrain from attending service until things are clarified. Even the mail carrier, who used to linger for small talk, now simply pushed the envelopes halfway into the slot and hurried off. I told myself it would all be cleared up soon, that some misunderstanding had metastasized into panic, that Allison, my daughter, the girl who once refused to sleep without her stuffed rabbit, could not possibly believe whatever had been said. But when I tried her number again, it was disconnected. The next morning, I found an envelope tucked under my door. It was from her attorney, crisp and impersonal, notifying me of a restraining order, temporary, for the safety and comfort of the involved parties. The words didn't belong to any world I knew. I read them again and again until they blurred into a texture of ink and disbelief. I called the lawyer listed on the bottom, a woman whose voice sounded younger than the authority she carried, and she said, "Mr. Henley, it's best you refrain from contacting your daughter until the hearing. Anything you say could complicate matters." I asked what matters she meant, but she repeated the same sentence, as if language itself had decided to circle around me rather than reach me. That night I couldn't sleep. The house felt smaller, the shadows sharper. I kept replaying every conversation I'd had with Allison over the past year, searching for some hidden moment that could explain her silence. There was the argument about the children's summer camp fees, the afternoon she accused me of being too nostalgic, the time I corrected Sam's grammar, and she told me I was undermining her authority. None of it amounted to this exile. At 3 a.m, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote her a letter, long and clumsy, pleading not for forgiveness, but for clarity. I left it unsent because every sentence sounded like evidence of something I didn't understand. Days bled into each other. The police never came back, but the isolation thickened. My phone rang only with telemarketers and my own heartbeat. The church newsletter stopped arriving. The men from the cribbage circle said they were taking a break, which was their polite way of saying I had been quietly replaced. It's remarkable how swiftly a life can be reduced to an echo once people are told to doubt you. I started walking at dawn before anyone could see me, the same route Ruth and I used to take on weekends, down to the river trail where the cottonwoods leaned over the water. The quiet there was kinder, less aware of rumors. I practiced breathing until it sounded human again. One afternoon, about a week later, I received an official notice from the county court. The letterhead was immaculate, the language merciless in its composure. There would be a custody hearing involving my daughter's children, and I was listed among the potential persons of concern. It was the kind of phrase that seems to invent a crime by the very act of naming it. I sat down on the porch step, the sun pressing on my back, and felt the ground tilt slightly under me. I realized that whatever this accusation was, it had already accomplished most of its work. Whether proven or dismissed, it had rewritten me in the minds of everyone who mattered. In the evenings, I began to hear small noises outside, footsteps, maybe reporters, maybe my imagination. Once I saw a car pause at the end of the street with its headlights off, and I went inside and turned off my porch light, suddenly ashamed of wanting to be seen. I tried to pray, but the words scattered. It wasn't that I doubted God. I simply couldn't find the tone that would make him believe me. When I finally called a local lawyer, recommended by a retired colleague, I caught myself apologizing before explaining anything, as if guilt had already moved in and was rearranging my furniture. The lawyer listened, said he would look into the documents, and told me to prepare for a long process. His final words before hanging up were the same I had used with anxious students years ago. Don't panic. The truth always finds its way. I wanted to believe him, but I'd been a teacher long enough to know that sometimes truth loses interest halfway through the lesson. That night I stood in the doorway of Ruth's old sewing room, which I had left untouched since she died, and the sight of her thread spools lined up by color broke something in me. I spoke aloud to the air, to her, to anyone who might still recognize my voice. I don't know what's happening, I said, but I swear I've lived a life without malice. The room didn't answer, but the silence felt different, almost listening. For the first time in days, I allowed myself to cry, not from fear, though fear was there, but from the knowledge that a single unseen hand had tilted my whole world, and there was nothing, for the moment, that I could do to set it right. The first ripple became a wave so quickly that I still catch myself looking for the moment where a reasonable life could have braced and steadied. But escalation has its own physics, and it began with paperwork that multiplied on my kitchen table like a fast disease, with envelopes stamped in severe fonts and signatures that belonged to people who would never have to see the faces their ink rearranged. And soon I was sitting opposite my new attorney, a man named Crane, whose suit had the quiet confidence of someone who has spent a career translating panic into billable hours. And he explained in careful, unhurried phrases that there would be protective orders and interim measures and a custody calendar that would sweep me up even though I was not a party to the divorce, and that my name, which had once fit comfortably on birthday cards and report cards and a small brass Teacher of the Year plaque, was now an annotation in a narrative that others would keep revising without my consent. And while he spoke, I felt the oddest sensation that the air between us had grown thicker, as if every word needed to push through something dense before it reached me. He told me to say very little to anyone and to write down everything, to become my own court reporter because memory would be challenged and motives would be questioned. And he slid a small legal pad toward me like a life preserver and said that order is a kind of defense, even when justice is sleeping. And I nodded as if I understood how to turn my days into exhibits. Then walked home through a neighborhood that looked unchanged and felt entirely altered, because even the maples seemed to be whispering about me, now that the group text had found my name. At church, the usher met me in the narthex with a practiced sorrow and suggested that, for the community's peace, I might choose online services until matters clarified, and I stood there with the bulletin in my hand and watched the sanctuary I had helped paint during a fundraiser swallow up the hymn without me. And I thought how easily institutions slide the bolt with a prayer on their lips. And I went back to my car and sat for a long time, listening to the radio describe other people's tragedies with the briskness of sports scores. And it occurred to me that catastrophe is a kind of weather. When it arrives, the first thing you do is check whether anyone else is getting wet. The school district where I volunteered twice a month sent a bland email thanking me for my years of engagement and placing me on an inactive list pending review, which was the bureaucratic way of saying that a rumor had already outweighed a resume, and the grocery store cashier who used to slip me jokes about the avocados now studied the conveyor belt as if humor had been recalled for safety reasons, and my name appeared on the neighborhood forum beneath a post titled Concerns, where a neighbor with a sunlit profile picture suggested vigilance, and a dozen replies agreed in the tone of people discovering moral courage at last. And I read every word because pain comes with curiosity stitched to it, and because it is impossible not to look at the portrait someone else paints of you, even when they use a color you have never worn. The legal steps multiplied. A notice of a temporary order that prohibited me from approaching my grandchildren's school, which I had never done uninvited, but which now became a temptation I had to wrestle with like a shameful impulse. A letter from my insurer announcing a pause in umbrella coverage due to material risk. A bank call to verify that my accounts were for personal use only, as if malice had a ledger, and a crisp packet from my daughter's attorney announcing her intent to introduce professional opinions about family safety. And in each document I could feel the steady pressure of a machine that had learned my coordinates and was aligning its gears. Even my mailbox began to sound accusatory when it closed. One afternoon, a county caseworker came to my door with a companion and a clipboard and explained that she needed to ask routine background questions, and I invited them in because I have spent my life believing that decency appears ordinary up close. And we sat at the same table where I had once helped Allison glue macaroni to construction paper and make a crown. And I answered questions about my childhood, my temperament, my career, the way I handled disappointment. And when I described my wife's last morning, the caseworker nodded with what might have been kindness or protocol. And afterward she thanked me for my time without promising that any of it would matter. And when they left, I washed the two glasses as if rinsing out the residue of officialdom. I learned the choreography of avoidance, the way neighbors time their trash cans so our paths do not cross. The way adults look busy when your cart turns down their aisle. The way silence gathers like fog around your name at the end of a pew. And I learned that even the body participates in escalation, because my chest tightened when I saw a school bus, and my hands shook when a text arrived from an unknown number, and my sleep soured into anxious vigilance. And still, I told myself to be careful with my own mind, to distinguish between what had happened and what fear predicted, which is a distinction easier to teach than to practice. Crane, my attorney, advised me to collect anything that showed the ordinary truth of my life, which sounded absurd and also necessary. And so I found myself printing photographs of birthday cakes and picnic blankets and a child's tower of books. I collected emails that recorded thank yous and calendars that recorded pickups, and the small notes my grandchildren had left on my refrigerator with magnets shaped like fruit. And I placed them in a binder that made my history feel both safe and miniature. There is nothing quite as humiliating as having to prove that you have lived a simple life without malice. And yet I did it with a clerk's thoroughness, because ordinary days are not self-authenticating once a story with darker fonts begins to circulate. The first hearing on the temporary matters was scheduled in a courtroom whose ceiling fixtures hummed as if electricity were impatient. And I sat in the second row behind Crane and watched Allison enter in a navy blazer I had never seen, her hair pulled back with the severe neatness she used to reserve for exams. And she did not look at me, which hurt more than any glare, because the refusal to see is its own verdict. And on the other side of the room, her attorney whispered to a colleague with the composure of someone arranging flowers for a funeral. And when the judge took the bench, he spoke in an efficient cadence that made everything sound smaller than the lives it contained. And I felt the strangeness of being a spectator in a room where my identity was under discussion. There is a specific humiliation in the realization that no one needs your body to be present in order to rearrange your moral furniture. And when the temporary orders were extended and the next date set, and the people filed out with the bored energy of clerks catching a bus, I remained in my seat for too long, because getting up would make the outcome real. And then the bailiff, who had been studying the back wall with professional detachment, reminded me that the room wanted to be empty. Outside the courthouse, I saw Nate across the plaza with his hands in his pockets, and for a moment it looked as if he might come over and offer a handhold in the rushing water. But then he looked at his shoes and turned away, with the slow caution of someone trying to avoid recognition by himself. And I understood the rule of this new country I now inhabited. No one wants proximity to a man whose name has started to attract footnotes, and people confuse self-preservation with prudence and call it wisdom. I walked home the long way to avoid the post-hearing crowd in the parking garage, and halfway there my phone buzzed with an alert from the neighborhood forum that someone had posted a safety reminder regarding unverified but troubling matters. And though I told myself not to read it, I opened it anyway, because abstinence is a discipline, and I was out of training, and there I found versions of myself I did not recognize, written by people who had never been in my kitchen or my classroom, and as I scrolled, I felt my face grow warm with a despair that had nowhere respectable to sit. And I closed the app and deleted my account, and immediately felt like a man who has burned a map after reading that dragons live where he used to picnic. Money, that quiet servant of dignity, began to complain. The retainer for Crane was a sum that made me use the handrail when I left his office, and each subsequent invoice arrived with the unwelcome honesty of a bathroom mirror, and I began to calculate the value of my tools and the wood in my shed and the spare car I no longer drove, because even if truth eventually wins, it rarely pays your bills in real time, and I had no appetite for being right from a smaller apartment. I considered selling the house, then told myself not to make decisions in a panic, then looked at the roofline as if it could answer for me. At night I sat at the table with a pencil and a pad and made lists that started with "Stay calm" and ended with "Be brave." And in between, I wrote names of former colleagues who might write letters and of students who had become respectable adults who might vouch for the person I have been. And I drafted emails that were careful in tone and humble in ask. And the replies arrived like lighthouse beams through fog, some steady and bright, some hesitant and dim, and each one forced me to see myself through someone else's memory, which was both consoling and terrifying. Small humiliations kept their schedule. An usher called to say the choir preferred I not attend rehearsal. For the time being, the men at cribbage announced they were pausing the games until winter, as if weather could explain fear. The library informed me my volunteer badge needed to be revalidated in 6 months. A neighbor crossed the street and pretended to admire a shrub rather than wave. An old friend from the district replied to my careful note with a sentence that began with, "In this climate," and I felt the peculiar exhaustion that comes from having to absorb the apologies people do not make. I began to carry my phone with the voice memo app open whenever I left the house, not to collect anyone else's shame, but to record my own small exchanges, so that if a conversation later grew a different tale in someone's telling, I could pull a thread of sound from my pocket and say gently, "That had not been the shape of the afternoon." It made me feel foolish and also protected, like a man walking with an umbrella under a clear sky because he has seen how quickly summers turn. Twice I almost drove past the children's school at pickup just to see a human proof that my family still produced laughter, and twice I turned away 2 blocks early because to test the edge of an order is to step into the prosecutor's outline, and that is a dance I do not know. In the middle of all this, the doorbell rang one evening, and I opened it to find a reporter with a sympathetic tilt to her head and a camera operator who clearly wanted to be elsewhere. And she asked if I wished to share my side for balance. And I looked at the lens and saw no place to rest my voice. So I declined and shut the door gently and immediately felt as if I had surrendered the script to a chorus that did not like my key. And I paced the hall like a man who has misplaced his medicine. Sleep moved further away. When I did drift off, I woke with the sense that I had been running through a building with no exits. And I would sit up and listen for the refrigerator's hum and make tea, and lay out my documents on the table and trace the shape of my own life with my finger as if maps were talismans against erasure. One afternoon, Allison's attorney scheduled depositions and included my name on a list with strangers whose summaries of me would be read as evidence. And the envelope also contained a preliminary note from a professional I had never met, which suggested grave concerns in a tone so precise it might have been carved. And I learned then that handwriting can wound even when it is typed. And Crane told me it was expected and counseled patience and promised motions to exclude and mechanisms to test credibility. And I nodded because I could not invent a better plan. Later that week, in a moment that felt ordinary, even as it changed the future, I pulled open the junk drawer where I keep batteries and rubber bands and the flotsam of competence, and my hand closed on the little black recorder I had used in my teaching years, and I held it and remembered the comfort of precise recall, the way a faithful playback ends arguments before they fully bloom, and I placed fresh batteries beside it and did not yet know that a tool kept out of habit might soon become the hinge on which this terrible door would swing. By the end of the month, I had learned to move through town with a dignity that was mostly posture, to answer the phone on the 3rd ring so I would not sound eager for vindication, to leave lights on in rooms I was not in because I needed the house to look less like it was hiding, and to forgive myself 3 times a day for the sin of imagining how easily this could end if someone I loved simply told the truth out loud. Escalation had done its work, stretching every thread until it sang. and I understood that the next turn would not be won by endurance alone, that something quieter but sharper would be required. And though I did not yet know where it would come from, I felt the faintest click inside me, the way a lock sometimes answers your key with relief rather than resistance. And I told myself to keep walking toward morning, because mornings keep promising a fairer light even when nights have been practicing their lies. It was near the end of October when the rhythm of my days, already off-key, collapsed entirely. The mornings had turned thin and silver, the kind of light that makes even dusk look accusatory, and I had begun to live like a man under mild house arrest, cataloging hours by their small noises, the kettle, the mail slot, the thud of the neighbor's newspaper hitting his porch. My lawyer, Crane, had stopped promising quick resolutions. "It's procedural gravity," he said during our last meeting. "These things move at the speed of their own momentum." I sat across from him, staring at a framed certificate that reflected my own face in the glass, and felt an exhaustion that had no corresponding word. It was not despair exactly, but a sense that my own existence had become a witness in someone else's case. One evening I drove to the grocery store after dark, which I rarely did anymore, because I'd grown sensitive to the possibility of eyes. The parking lot was half empty. The automatic doors sighed like something tired of service, and I walked the aisles in a kind of trance, not for food, but for proof that the world still contained objects that did not hold opinions about me. On the way home, I took the long route past Allison's subdivision, a reflex I kept pretending was accidental. Her windows were lit in gold rectangles, the domestic geometry of safety. And for a moment I imagined knocking, simply asking her to step outside and tell me truthfully what had happened. But the thought of the restraining order folded that impulse in half. I parked a block away, sat in the car, and tried to remember whether forgiveness was supposed to feel like surrender or like courage. The next morning, as I was making coffee, my phone lit up with a reminder to pay a subscription I didn't recognize. It was linked to the cloud service I used years ago to back up photos for Ruth when she was sick and wanted to see the old family albums on her tablet. I opened it out of idle curiosity and found a folder I didn't recall creating. Inside were audio files, most of them blank or static, but one carried a timestamp from early August, around the time I had visited Allison, to drop off a box of books the children had left behind. My pulse quickened with that old teacher's instinct to investigate what doesn't belong. I pressed play, expecting nothing more than the scrape of a misplaced pocket recording. Instead, I heard voices. The first was Allison's, familiar yet sharpened into something businesslike. The second belonged to a man, calm, clipped, the rhythm of someone paid to strategize. The sound quality was uneven, words dissolving in pockets of noise, but the meaning was unmistakable. They were discussing me, not the past, but a plan. I felt the blood rise in my ears, the kind of pulse that drowns out thought. I listened again, slower this time, forcing myself to remain still while the voices outlined steps that could only exist in a world where truth was a resource to be mined, shaped, and sold. When the file ended, I sat very still at the table, the coffee cooling beside me, and for the first time since this nightmare began, the chaos rearranged itself into a pattern that made sense in the most horrifying way. I didn't move for an hour. I was afraid that if I did, the fragile boundary between knowledge and sanity would break. I replayed the recording 3 times, each time trying to invent some charitable interpretation, some way to believe I had misunderstood what I'd heard. But there was no such mercy. It was deliberate. The betrayal was not an accident born of fear or confusion. It was a design. And the voice of my own child had participated in it with a confidence that left me cold. I walked through the house as if inspecting the wreckage of a flood, touching the backs of chairs, the edges of picture frames, the indentation on the couch where the grandchildren had sat, as though these objects might remind me of a world before strategy. Ruth's photograph hung in the hallway, her eyes mid-laugh, and I found myself speaking to it. "You were right about her temper," I said, though what I meant was, you could have stopped this. But the photo, steady in its frame, refused to look away, and I realized I was blaming the dead because the living were beyond reach. When I finally called Crane, my hands were shaking so badly that I dropped the phone twice. I told him what I had found. He was silent for a long moment, then asked if I was sure. "Absolutely," I said. He told me to make copies immediately, to store one somewhere outside the house, and not to tell anyone else. His voice had changed, not disbelief, but a careful tone that sounded like he was thinking several moves ahead. "This changes everything," he said finally. "But we have to be cautious. Timing will matter." I hung up and sat staring at the phone as if it might start confessing too. That night I couldn't bring myself to eat. I walked the perimeter of the house over and over, checking locks, though from what threat I couldn't have said. The air felt charged, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I opened a notebook and began to write, not for evidence, but for sanity. I wrote the exact time I had discovered the file, what was said, how my body reacted. I described the moment in sensory detail. The smell of burnt coffee, the hum of the refrigerator, the light from the porch lamp seeping through the blinds. I told myself that as long as I could document reality, I wouldn't lose it. When I finished, I realized I had filled 10 pages in a hand I barely recognized. Sleep that night came in fragments. I dreamed of my classroom, the blackboard filled with words I couldn't read, the students staring silently while I tried to erase them. When I woke, my throat was sore from having spoken aloud in my sleep. I made tea instead of coffee and sat by the window as dawn spread across the street. The world outside looked insultingly normal. Trash bins aligned, sprinklers turning, the newspaper folded with its headline about local elections. And I felt the absurdity of how quiet evil can sound when it's clothed in procedure. In the following days, I made duplicate copies of the recording and stored one in the glove compartment of my car, another in a sealed envelope at the bank's deposit box. I bought a cheap digital clock so I could mark time without consulting my phone, because I no longer trusted anything connected to the cloud. Each small precaution became a ritual, a way of reclaiming a fragment of control. When Crane called to schedule a meeting, his tone was brisk but charged. "We have to decide how to introduce it," he said. "If we mishandle it, it could be dismissed as inadmissible." He used the word "we," but I knew he meant that the decision, the moral weight, rested on me. For the first time, I understood that I held not just evidence, but a kind of power. And the knowledge frightened me. It was a reversal of helplessness so sudden it felt indecent. I had imagined vindication as relief, but this was something else, a grim awareness that I now possessed the ability to destroy my daughter's life, as thoroughly as she had tried to ruin mine. The thought sickened me. I sat on the edge of my bed, clutching the device, and whispered into the dark. What would justice look like if love were still part of it? No answer came, but the question refused to leave. 2 days later, I met Crane in his office. He played the recording through headphones, his expression a careful mask of professionalism. But when it ended, he exhaled sharply and said, "Mr. Henley, this is conclusive. We'll prepare a motion to submit it under seal. It may take time, but this will shift the ground." I nodded, though my mind was elsewhere, tangled in memories of Allison at 16, arguing with Ruth about curfews, slamming her door, then slipping into our room at midnight to apologize. I tried to reconcile that trembling girl with the voice on the recording and failed. When I returned home, the house felt unfamiliar again, as though it had overheard everything and was now reconsidering its allegiance. I made a deliberate effort to perform normal life, washed the dishes, watered the plants, sorted the mail, but every motion was mechanical, a pantomime of domesticity. I caught my reflection in the window and was startled by the hardness in my face. It was the look of someone who had stopped waiting for the world to be fair. That evening, as the sun went down, I took a slow walk around the block. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke. Children rode bicycles in erratic circles, their laughter floating upward like something untouchable. I realized then that the recording, for all its promise of redemption, had also imprisoned me in a different way. I could no longer pretend ignorance, no longer hope for reconciliation built on misunderstanding. The story had crossed a line from tragedy to betrayal, and there was no going back. When I got home, I placed the recorder in the drawer beside my bed and turned off the light. I lay awake for hours, listening to the wind tapping against the window pane, thinking of how every truth carries within it the seed of ruin, and wondering whether, in trying to defend my name, I had already lost the last chance to save my daughter's soul. The days that followed the discovery did not feel like a triumph or a rescue, but like stepping into a deeper weather system, a heavy front that erased the horizon and made every street look like a detour. Because once you hold proof, you also inherit the burden of timing and the knowledge that one clumsy move can turn the truth into debris. And Crane reminded me of this with the patience of a man who has watched righteous evidence die on procedural hills. So we spoke in low voices about chains of custody and the dangers of talking to anyone, even friends who might mean well, but love drama more than accuracy. And he filed something I was not allowed to name because it had to travel in sealed envelopes and whisper through clerks. And he began to answer emails with a brevity that reassured me and made me afraid in equal measure, because competence is a comfort until you realize it is required. The other side, which is how I had begun to refer to people I once called family, did not retreat. If anything, they grew taller, because within a week a motion arrived that sought to paint the recording as illicit and me as a man who had learned his tactics from television, accompanied by an affidavit that read like a short story in which I was the unreliable narrator with a conveniently selective memory. And there were references to regulations and privacy, and the word suppression appeared so often it began to sound like a piece of furniture you bump into at night. And Crane explained that this was expected, that pushback is the second act of every battle, and that my job was to remain still and careful and not let my temper hire its own attorney. It is one thing to be insulted in private and another to be slandered with a smile under fluorescent lights. And I learned this in a hallway outside a hearing room when her attorney, the man whose voice I had heard trying to shape my future like clay, passed by with a nod that seemed to congratulate us both on our professionalism. And in that moment I understood a small and brutal fact about the world I had entered, which is that people can destroy you without hating you. They can do it out of habit, out of training, out of a belief that the story must be made symmetrical, even if it requires a little cutting. And knowing this did not make me stronger. It only made the air feel thinner. The judge, a woman with a gaze that could sand wood, scheduled arguments on various preliminary matters and made it clear she disliked surprises. And Crane whispered that this was good news for us, because chaos benefits those who lie, while order is the ally of those with receipts. And I nodded and tried to look like a man who had slept. The practical humiliations gathered momentum the way snow gathers along a fence line. The insurance company wrote again to inform me that my rates would increase provisionally. My volunteer clearance was revoked, pending an updated risk assessment. My pastor left a second message that managed to be both kind and unambiguous in its request that I refrain from attending in person. And at the grocery store, the cashier who had once called me by my last name now used sir with the tone of a clerk practicing for a security job. And while none of these were mortal wounds, they formed a chorus that trained my body to flinch before the first note. So I began shopping at night, sitting in the back row of the matinee, walking at dawn, doing everything slightly earlier or later than the world to avoid colliding with its opinion of me. Money became the second antagonist. Every invoice arrived with its own gravity, and the savings Ruth and I had built with the unglamorous discipline of a teacher's marriage dwindled into numbers that looked less like a life and more like a countdown. So I sold the spare car and a set of woodworking tools that had been my one indulgence, and I learned the new arithmetic where dignity is measured in months of runway. And I told myself that facts once planted grow at their own pace and do not benefit from being shouted at, which is a lesson easier to teach adolescents than to live when your mailbox has begun to hiss. The first deposition was a clinic in how narratives are starched and pressed. I sat under a light that showed no mercy to old skin and answered questions whose shapes were knives, and the attorney smiled softly when he asked me about my memory, about the precise date I had borrowed a ladder, about conversations from years ago that I could recall in weather and objects but not in minute numbers, and with each gentle, "Is it possible you're mistaken?" I felt the scaffolding of doubt slide closer to my ribs, and I learned to breathe before I spoke, to turn back to the facts I could hold like stones in a pocket. And when it was over, I went home and slept with the kind of exhaustion that erases dreams. A week later, a letter arrived from a clinician I had never met offering an initial impression of my cognitive status, a masterpiece of hedged language that nevertheless gestured toward decline. And Crane had anticipated it, scheduling an independent evaluation with a team whose credentials were a wall of shields, and the tests were long and oddly intimate, asking me to anchor numbers in my mind and repeat lists and sketch shapes from memory. And as I worked my way through them, I felt a fury I had not known I could sustain. Not at the doctors, who were careful and thorough, but at the necessity of proving that thought still lived where it had always lived. Because there is no humiliation quite like having to demonstrate that you remain yourself. In the midst of this bureaucratic siege, there were moments that could have been mistaken for kindness if they had not arrived with strings. A reporter left a note on my doorstep promising to tell my side, which translated to lending my face to a story already under edit. A family friend relayed that Allison wished we could find a way to de-escalate privately, which my lawyer translated into a pressure campaign to abandon the evidence in exchange for a quieter ruin. And a neighbor I barely knew brought over a pie and spoke in euphemisms about how hard these misunderstandings must be, while managing to confirm she had chosen her allegiance based on the loudest whisper. And I thanked her because manners are an anchor when justice drifts. And afterward I ate one slice standing over the sink and threw the rest away because sweetness had begun to taste like an apology I could not afford. The second escalation announced itself in a courtroom where nothing was decided and everything changed, because that was the day the other side introduced a new construction of me, the controlling patriarch who refuses to respect boundaries, a diagnosis in narrative form designed to attach itself to every memory anyone had of me raising my voice to demand homework be finished before television. And the testimonies of two acquaintances, people I had known only in the soft focus of community events, were arranged like furniture to make the room look inevitable. And as I listened, I realized that I was no longer fighting a single accusation, but an architecture of insinuation, a cathedral erected from moments rearranged into stained glass. And it occurred to me with a sort of bitter academic clarity that the genre of my life had been switched without my permission, from quiet realism to a legal thriller where facts were props and tone was plot. And yet even then I took notes, because in note-taking there is dignity. Crane, to his credit, did not flinch. He filed comps of my evaluation results, which were clean and almost celebratory in their refusal to find decline. He built a chain of custody for the audio that would satisfy the most suspicious archivist. He drafted questions that would pry at the hinges of the other side's story without turning me into an executioner. And he repeated his mantra that patience is not passivity, that timing is a strategy, that a truth delivered too soon can be mistaken for a trick. He prepared me for the possibility that the judge would defer ruling on admissibility until the custody hearing itself, which is to say the most public of our private disasters, and the thought of waiting that long with fire in my pocket made my hands tremble so violently that I began carrying a paper cup of water everywhere I went, the ridiculousness of which kept me from shouting. At night I rehearsed, not lines, but composure. I practiced breathing while imagining the worst words and the cruelest looks. I practiced sitting still while someone I loved described me as a danger to the very people whose birthdays I still knew by the smell of cake frosting. And I practiced forgiving myself for not being eloquent when terror closed its hand around my throat. News travels along odd, obsolete wires. One afternoon Nate appeared on my porch and stood there like a man who had arrived at a confession and didn't know where to sit. And I let him in because there was a time when we were almost friends. And he spoke in low, exhausted tones about the children, about the pressure of choosing sides when neither side feels like the truth, about emails from Allison's lawyer that made his stomach burn. And he looked at me as if weighing the risk of kindness. And I told him he didn't owe me anything except the courage not to lie to himself. And we sat in a silence that felt briefly like shared weather until he said he should go. And at the door he paused and said that Lucy still kept the flat stone I had given her from the river, the one that looked like an egg, and that Sam had asked whether I still whistled when I made pancakes. And these sentences were both blessing and wound. And when the door clicked shut, I leaned my forehead against it and let the wood cool my skin. The second escalation also moved through my body. One morning I woke with a pressure in my chest that took the air and folded it into something unbreathable. And I sat on the edge of the bed and spoke to myself like a coach. And when the pressure refused to listen, I drove to the clinic, where a nurse with kind eyes attached me to machines and told me I was not dying, just living under a weight that bends even good hearts. And the doctor offered a mild medication and a stern suggestion to avoid triggers. And I almost laughed because my life was one continuous trigger. And instead, I accepted the pills and promised to walk more and to stop reading the comments on the neighborhood forum, which I had already deleted, but continued to visit in memory like a man checking the lock on a burned house. In preparation for the hearing, Crane asked me to compile a chronology of small goodnesses, which sounded sentimental until he explained that judges are human and context matters. And so I spent 2 evenings building a timeline no one had asked for when life was quiet. I listed the years I coached a reading club at the library. The weekends the children and I built birdhouses and donated them to the school auction. The hot afternoons I sat in a folding chair at science fairs and applauded other people's projects. The Christmas mornings when Ruth and I delivered baskets with the church deacons. And writing it down did not make me virtuous. It only made me visible to myself again, which turned out to be essential armor. I also wrote a letter I would never send, addressed to Allison, in which I declared that I would not use the evidence like a weapon, even though it could cut, that I would use it like a light, even though it would blind, and that I would ask for accountability rather than revenge, not because I am noble, but because I want the children to recognize me when this is over. And I folded the letter and placed it in Ruth's Bible, because she was better at keeping promises than I am. There was a day when everything seemed to tilt further than usual, when the other side filed a motion that essentially requested the court to presuppose my guilt to protect fragile parties. And though Crane had warned me such tactics were sometimes deployed to fog the field, the language struck me with such force that I had to sit on the kitchen floor and breathe like a swimmer between waves. And what steadied me was not faith in the system, but the prosaic detail that the floor was clean, because I had mopped it that morning, which is to say the ordinary will not surrender even when melodrama demands it. And this stubbornness of the everyday became part of my strength. The mailbox yielded a thin envelope from the independent evaluators, a crisp series of numbers and summaries that said I was who I have always been. And holding that paper, I felt not vindication, but relief, like a man who has been permitted to keep his own name. Word of the sealed filing drifted through the corridors as rumors do, attaching itself to side glances and whispered sidebars, and I began to see a new expression on the faces of professionals who previously met me with either disdain or pity. It was the look of people who suspect their maps may be wrong, and while I took no joy in it, I stored the observation as one stores the first sight of a clearing after walking too long in woods. In response, the other side sharpened their portrait of me. Outdated anecdotes were promoted to diagnoses. Strict parenting moments were restaged as a need for control, and a minor disagreement with a neighbor over a fence line 5 years ago was cited as proof of a temperament unsuited to gentle company, and I learned the discipline of not answering every little thing, because to do so is to wander from the road to stomp on sparks while the forest burns elsewhere. On a late afternoon that smelled like rain, a small kindness arrived without a signature. An elderly neighbor, Mrs. Dalton, stopped me by the mailbox, and after a nervous glance up and down the street, pressed a folded index card into my hand, whispering that she had taught with me years ago and never forgot how I stayed after school to help a boy catch up when others were too tired, and that she believed in my decency even if she didn't understand the law. And then she hurried away as if shielding both of us from consequences. And I stood there with the card like a relic and thought about how a life is not saved by declarations, but by accumulations. And I put the card in my wallet next to the photograph of Ruth, because both were proofs of something stubborn and good. In the evenings, I rehearsed again, not just for court, but for the version of myself I wanted to bring into that room. A man not governed by rage, a father who could hold the double truth that love and accountability are not enemies, a witness who would not let humiliation write his testimony. And I cleaned the house because order calmed me, and I laid out my suit, the one Ruth liked for its quiet fabric, and I wrote a single sentence on a scrap of paper to carry in my pocket. Tell the truth without trying to win. And I knew how naive that sounded in a building built to declare winners. But I also knew that survival had turned me into a strategist, and I did not want victory to finish the job by turning me into a stranger. On the last night before the hearing that would finally force the door, Crane called to review logistics, and after we checked the schedule and the sequence, and the unlikely contingencies, he paused and asked if I was all right, not in the professional sense, but in the human one. And the question startled me, because most inquiries in these months had been about my reputation or my capacity or my liability rather than my heart. And I told him the truth, that I was afraid of what light does to the people it exposes, that I wanted justice in the morning and a family by evening, and suspected the world did not sell that bundle. And he exhaled and said he could not help with the second part, but he would fight like a craftsman for the first. And after we hung up, I walked through the house and touched the back of each chair again, as if blessing an altar. When I finally lay down, sleep came without pictures, and in the gray hour before the alarm, I woke to the sound of wind pushing a branch against the window in a steady rhythm that sounded like someone knocking without insisting. And I thought that was as close to peace as I was going to get for now. And I rose and made coffee carefully and ate toast I could barely taste. And I took the recorder from the drawer and placed it in the inside pocket of my jacket, even though we had 10 backups and a plan that would not fail for want of hardware, because carrying it felt like carrying the last intact photograph of a person you need to remember exactly. And I stood at the door with my hand on the knob and told the quiet house that had witnessed my unmaking that I would try to return different, only in the ways that mattered. And then I stepped into a morning that had no interest in consolation and every intention of letting the next turn take its shape. The morning of the hearing arrived with a light the color of paper, dry and impartial, and I moved through the house as if it were a museum of what I had been trying to protect, touching the backs of chairs, straightening the frame of Ruth's photograph, folding a dish towel into clean thirds, then standing too long at the sink with the water running, letting the sound steady me because words had become slippery these last months, and water at least stayed honest. Crane picked me up in a car that smelled faintly of coffee and old courtrooms. He reviewed the schedule in a voice that did not rise or fall, the order of witnesses and the likely objections, the judge's habits and the etiquette of silence. And I listened with the endurance of a student who knows a test will measure not what he understands, but what he can keep from shaking out of his hands. And when we arrived, the courthouse swallowed us as if we were one more pair of footsteps in a building designed to turn footsteps into precedent. The hallway outside the courtroom was a tide pool of suits and strained smiles. Allison stood with her attorney a few yards away, her posture so composed I could feel the ache that must have come with holding it. And for a moment our eyes almost met, then slid past each other as if the invention of glass had been extended to human faces. And I knew the day would require a ferocity of gentleness I had not practiced in years, the kind that refuses to turn love into a weapon even when handed the sharpest edge. Inside, the judge took the bench with the quiet authority of someone who has long since exhausted the romance of judgment and kept the duty. She reviewed the motions like a teacher taking attendance, the room's temperature dropping a few degrees with each citation. And then we were moving, the docket closing behind us like a door that locks from the outside, testimony stacking itself into a scaffold I had to climb without looking down. And when the other side began, it was with a recital of concern that sounded like a lullaby for jurists, careful tones about safety and boundaries, and a portrait of me drawn from the most flattering angle for fear. And I sat still and let it pass through me like a weather front, because interrupting the rain does not stop a storm. Crane rose with that modest confidence I had learned to trust, and began the unglamorous craft of building a floor from facts. He did not reach for fire. He reached for sequence. He walked the judge through calendars and emails and the simple furniture of ordinary life that refuses to collapse under pressure if it was made honestly. And then he paused as if to confirm the room still had air, and asked permission to introduce a sealed exhibit whose foundation he explained with the patience of a watchmaker: chain of custody, provenance, the why and the when, and the how we knew what we knew. And as he spoke, I felt the tingling at the base of my skull that comes when a long-held breath begins to consider becoming oxygen. The other attorney stood and objected with the practiced indignation of a man who keeps his outrage in a holster. Words like unlawfully obtained and prejudicial and privacy doctrine were arranged with ceremonial precision, and for a moment I saw the judge balance competing temperatures in her mind. And then she asked questions that had the decency of a scalpel rather than a club, questions about access and intent, and whether the law meant to protect truth from sunlight or merely from carelessness. And when she finally ruled that the exhibit would be heard for limited purposes, subject to wait, not outright exclusion, the room changed its angle by a degree only those drowning could feel. Crane did not savor the moment. He signaled to the clerk, and what followed was not theater, but the sound of a lock answering the correct key. The plainness of voices that had not expected to be measured against daylight. The matter-of-fact architecture of a plan revealed without flourish. And though the content stayed within the boundaries we had agreed to and the judge had set, and no sordid allegation was paraded or repeated, the unmistakable intent came through like a watermark, and I felt the odd combination of grief and relief that follows the naming of what you already knew but could not yet prove. The air seemed to recede from the other table. Allison's attorney attempted to reframe with words like context and misinterpretation and the dangers of partiality, and he asked for a recess with the dignity of someone postponing a funeral until the relatives arrive. And when we reconvened, he tried again, summoning professional opinions that now looked like paper houses in a fresh wind. And the judge listened, her patience intact but her skepticism awake, and then asked for closing remarks on the evidentiary issue. And in that narrow lane, Crane delivered the only speech of the day that felt like a hand offered rather than a fist, saying in his even voice that this was not a trial of affection, but of integrity, that the court's task was not to punish estrangement, but to refuse to let process be the home of invention. And he sat down as if putting away a tool that had done its work. There are moments no one tells you how to survive, the few seconds after a ruling when the room continues to exist, but the version of your life that lived in other people's heads begins to loosen its grip. The judge spoke calmly, acknowledging the gravity without theatrics, and concluded that the record before her made it impossible to credit the narrative that had shadowed my name, that the orders built upon that narrative must be vacated or narrowed, that custody decisions must be informed by candor rather than choreography, and that certain matters warranted referral for further review outside her immediate purview. And when she finished, she looked not at me, but at the space between tables, which is where families go to become cases. I did not exhale. I simply stopped drowning, which is different from breathing, and the room's noises returned. The shuffle of papers, the creak of a bench, the throat clearing of a man who has lost the argument but not his salary. And in that clatter, Allison remained very still, her hands folded on the table, her gaze fixed on a point that did not exist. And for a terrible instant, I saw the little girl who used to sit on the kitchen floor with crayons and draw doors where there were walls. And I wanted to reach across the aisle and say that truth had not been my vengeance. It had been my last prayer. Outside the courtroom, the corridor hummed with other people's crises waiting their turn. Crane squeezed my shoulder, a small human gesture that registered more clearly than the words he said about next steps and written orders and follow-up filings. And then he went to deal with the clerk, and I was alone with my coat in my hands and a sensation in my body like an earthquake that had decided to end without aftershocks. And Allison stepped out with her attorney trailing a pace behind. And for the first time that day, her eyes met mine, and in them was pride fighting a losing battle with shame. And she opened her mouth and then closed it again. And I understood that there are apologies the throat cannot shape when the mind is still trying to sell itself a cheaper story. So I spared her the demand and simply said, as evenly as I could, that I would not pursue punishments I could not live with, that I would ask the court for what protected the children and nothing more, that I would answer questions from officials, but not from the curious, and that if she ever wished to speak as a daughter rather than a litigant, my door would be unlocked at dusk. And then I stepped past, before mercy could start to sound like condescension. The order, when it was printed and stamped and slid across to us, was as unemotional as arithmetic. The accusations withdrawn for lack of credibility, the restraining measures dissolved, the custody recalibrated to ensure the children's stability under neutral supervision, while the adults reconsidered the meaning of the word adult, and a note that certain representations would be reviewed by appropriate authorities, because courts cannot pretend a lie is a misunderstanding without becoming complicit. And as I read it, I felt neither victory nor triumph, only a settling, as if a picture frame had finally found its nail. In the parking lot, I sat in Crane's car with the window cracked and listened to the wind moving through the elms, and he asked if I wished to speak to the press, and I said no, because the story had already taken too much oxygen. And besides, I did not trust myself not to turn grateful into bitter in front of microphones. So we drove in a quiet that felt almost courteous. And when he left me at my house, I stood in the doorway a long time before going in, as if asking the rooms for permission to return. The afternoon widened into evening, and the phone stayed mostly silent. A single message from Nate saying the children were safe and would be told carefully that grown-ups had said foolish things and that he hoped we could find a way to let them hear my whistle again when pancakes sizzled. And I listened to that message twice and then put the phone down and walked from room to room, turning on lamps, teaching the house how to be kind to me after so much suspicion. Only at night did the weight of the day arrive in a form I could hold. I sat at the kitchen table and wrote in my notebook that justice had come at the price I predicted, that reputations heal slower than rulings, that love is not math, but it does require accounting, and that I would wake tomorrow and go to the river and sit on the same bench where I had once nearly abandoned hope and teach myself to breathe like a man who has decided to stay. When I finally went to bed, I placed the small recorder back in the drawer without ceremony, a tool retired after its service. And before turning out the light, I stood in the hallway and faced Ruth's photograph. And I said aloud that I had tried to keep our name clean without bleaching out our daughter, that I had chosen the kind of truth that does not clap for itself, and that if there was any mercy left in the world, it should fall first on the children, who deserved a story without stage directions. And then I slept, not long and not deeply, but without dreaming of doors that would not open, which for one night was enough. The months that followed were not a return, but a slow apprenticeship in living after noise, the kind of silence that does not comfort at first, but stretches like an unfamiliar fabric until the body remembers how to move inside it. The court's decision had entered the public record and then, as all things do, had been replaced by newer scandals, leaving behind only a faint trace in digital archives and a few awkward corrections in local gossip. People who had avoided me now offered cautious nods at the grocery store, the same way a congregation greets someone who has survived a surgery too severe to be congratulated. And I responded with the politeness of a man grateful for small decencies, but unwilling to perform gratitude for borrowed courage. The house resumed its natural quiet, a different kind of quiet than before, one that included memory, but not accusation, and I found that I could once again listen to the sound of my own footsteps without hearing them as evidence. Crane closed the case file and mailed me the final paperwork, a thick envelope that looked heavier than it was. Inside were copies of the rulings, receipts, and letters of apology drafted in careful legal language by those who had once been certain of my guilt, but now required the word misunderstanding to preserve their dignity. I filed everything in a cabinet and labeled the folder simply Winter, because that was the season in which the world had frozen and thawed around me. Money was low, but manageable. I sold a few possessions, canceled subscriptions, and discovered that the simplest purchases, a loaf of bread, a newspaper, a bus ticket, were small proofs of independence. I walked to the river every morning, carrying a notebook and Ruth's old thermos, and I sat on the same bench where I had once thought about ending everything, writing instead about the persistence of ordinary beauty, the way frost outlines the edges of fallen leaves, the way water forgets nothing, yet holds no grudges. In time, the children returned, not in a cinematic rush of reunion, but in hesitant increments. The first meeting took place at a supervised center, a sterile room with soft chairs and an unseen observer behind a one-way glass. Sam entered first, taller than I remembered, carrying a model airplane he had built, which he set on the table as if to test whether gravity had changed. Lucy followed, clutching a book and glancing at the mirror, aware of the watching eyes, but pretending not to be. I had rehearsed what to say, something measured and adult. But when they sat down, all that came out was their names, one after the other, like a prayer I hadn't realized I was still capable of. They answered with shy smiles, and we spoke about school, about their dog, about pancakes. And when the hour ended and they were let out, Lucy turned and waved, a small, unconscious gesture that restored a continent of hope. Over the next months the visits lengthened. The glass barrier was replaced by a counselor's quiet presence, and eventually by an open park bench where we could breathe the same air without permission slips. Allison remained absent. There were letters from her lawyer about compliance with custody agreements and evaluations, all written in that clinical dialect that turns family into logistics. Then, one afternoon in early spring, a handwritten envelope appeared in my mailbox. The handwriting was hers, though more careful, as if she had practiced the act of addressing me. Inside was a short note, not an apology, not even an explanation, but a sentence that began, "I don't expect forgiveness," and ended, "I'm trying to understand what fear does to love." There was no return address, only her initials. I read it once, folded it, and placed it in Ruth's Bible next to the letter I had written months earlier. I did not answer. Some conversations are not meant to resume until both participants have learned a new language. Life narrowed to essentials and, paradoxically, became larger. I returned to volunteering at the library, where they welcomed me back with a mixture of embarrassment and sincerity. I helped children find books about rivers and bridges, and sometimes when Lucy and Sam visited, we would sit in the reading corner and share stories, each of us pretending we were merely readers and not a family, still learning to exist without rehearsing its pain. On Sundays, I went back to church, not out of habit, but out of curiosity about what faith becomes after it has been tested by humiliation. The pastor who had once asked me to stay away approached after service, eyes wet, and said, "I'm sorry we were cautious." I told him caution was understandable, that fear has better attendants than forgiveness. He laughed softly and nodded, and that was enough. The seasons turned without ceremony. I planted a small garden behind the house, tomatoes and basil mostly, though I was really growing patience. The neighbors began to speak again. One even asked my advice about his gutters, which felt like the local equivalent of absolution. At night, I listened to old jazz records Ruth had loved, the scratches on the vinyl matching the small imperfections in my own story. And I found comfort in the idea that music survives by repeating what once hurt until it becomes rhythm. I no longer checked the internet for my name. Whatever lingered there belonged to history, not to me. In late summer, the children came for a weekend visit. They ran through the yard, chasing the same light that had once held their mother at that age. And I grilled hamburgers and tried not to measure every laugh against its absence. After dinner, we sat on the porch, watching the first stars appear. Sam asked if I was happy now. I thought about it before answering. Happiness, I said, is too noisy a word. Let's say I'm quiet, in a good way. He nodded, accepting that as a satisfactory definition. Lucy leaned against me and said that her mom might come next time, if she's brave enough. I didn't answer. I just put my arm around her shoulders, filing the weight of hope like something alive. When they left the next morning, I stood on the porch long after the car had disappeared. The garden was still wet with dew, the air carrying the scent of soil and something faintly sweet. I realized that forgiveness is not a decision, but a landscape. You enter it slowly, and if you keep walking, the horizon eventually softens. I went inside, opened my notebook, and wrote one sentence to mark the end of that chapter. The truth stayed, but it learned to speak more softly. Then I closed the book, set the kettle to boil, and watched the steam rise in the morning light. A quiet testimony that heat, if tended, becomes warmth instead of fire. That evening I took Ruth's photo from the hallway and placed it on the kitchen table beside the small stone Lucy had once pocketed from the river. I told her aloud that things had been set right. Not perfectly, not neatly, but right enough for a man who has learned that justice is only the first half of mercy. Outside, the wind shifted through the trees, carrying the sounds of children playing somewhere down the street. And I thought that maybe this was what redemption actually felt like. Not triumph or reconciliation, but the permission to live without defending every breath. When the porch light came on automatically, as it always had, I let it burn long past midnight, not as a beacon for anyone's return, but as a small act of faith that light, once restored, should be allowed to keep its vigil without supervision.